Hello and welcome, everybody. It is International Podcast Day 2017. Don't forget to be using hashtag International Podcast Day to join in the celebration and to celebrate the power of podcasting. Well, the top of this hour, we have Sean and Mike from Blueberry. Blueberry is our proud platinum sponsor this year for International Podcast Day. Coming up in the next 50 plus minutes, they're going to be talking about podcast problems, what to do when things go wrong. So, before we introduce and let Mike and Sean take over the show, we'd like to thank our sponsors for International Podcast Day. Of course, as I just mentioned, Blueberry, our platinum sponsor, is a full-service podcasting company, a turnkey solution that will allow a new or veteran podcaster to get set up and running within 15 minutes. Get started at blueberry.com. Studio 21 Podcast Cafe is a full-service cafe with 2 working podcasting and video casting studios. The grand opening happens today, September 30th, where they'll be broadcasting live throughout the day. Learn more and visit them at studio21podcast.cafe. The Messengers, a podcast documentary, is a journey through the modern world of podcasting, uncovering the magic behind why podcasters do what they do. Get your copy of The Messengers in iTunes and on Amazon by visiting themessengersdoc.com. Podable, looking for your next favorite podcast? Podable revolutionizes podcast discovery by providing podcast recommendations tailored to you. Start by going to play.podable.co. That's play.podable.co. And finally, thank you to the Audacity Podcast, the Modern Life Podcast Network, and Podbean. Well, without further ado, Mike and Sean, we are really excited to have you representing Blueberry, our platinum sponsor for this event. It's great to have you guys. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing good, Dave. How are you?
Yeah, doing well. Well, I am going to get out of the way, and you guys, there's a lot of podcast problems out there, what to do when things go wrong. So we're really looking forward to your event, and I will see you in a little bit.
Okay, thanks, Dave. And yeah, my name is Sean Thorpe, and I'm with Mike Dell. We are both on the support team at Blueberry, the full-service podcasting company that provides, well, a lot of services for podcasters. How are you doing today, Mike?
Oh, so far, so good, Sean. And everybody out there, happy Podcast Day, International Podcast Day. It's been a long day for me already, so.
All right, well, we'll keep it going here. So, as I mentioned earlier, Mike and I do work in support over at Blueberry, and when we were brainstorming what to do a presentation on today, we sort of tossed out some ideas, and then the one that struck me the most was, well, what's something that we're knowledgeable about that we can actually provide value to listeners on? And of course, we help podcasters every day kind of troubleshoot different technical problems. And you know, the title of the session, Podcast Problems, What to Do When Things Go Wrong. Obviously, there are a lot of moving parts to a podcast, and there's no way we could possibly cover everything from, you know, microphones, mixers, mix minuses, remote recording, group conferences, all that kind of stuff, all the way through to show notes and publishing platforms. So what we decided to do is we came up with kind of a short list and kind of focus on some things that we think are super important that maybe not a lot of people think of at the top of mind. But we're going to start by talking about troubleshooting RSS. So what to do when something goes wrong with your RSS feed. And you know, RSS, of course, as hopefully we all know, is kind of the lifeblood, really, of this medium. I think you'd agree with that, Mike?
Oh, yeah. It's like the transmitter for your radio station. Everybody tunes to that, and that is the most important part.
Now, mercifully, in 2017, we have a lot of great tools, robust, mature tools that have been around for a long time to help us publish and manage our podcast RSS feeds. Wasn't like that when I started in 2005. And Mike, I'm sure you remember what that was like back then as well. So we're fortunate in that we have these great tools, but sometimes things unexpectedly do go wrong. And again, we're lucky that for the most part, that component, as vital as it is, the RSS feed, it is kind of hidden in the firmament of the tools we use. for the most part, we don't ever have to think about it. It's out of our way, and that's the best way for it to be. But sometimes, things do go wrong with it, and it can be very mysterious and magical, especially if you've never really had to think about what's in an RSS feed and how it works. So what are your thoughts on this so far, Mike?
Oh yeah, definitely. Most podcast users or listeners don't have to mess with the RSS. They go to whatever app, they look for a podcast, they find it, they subscribe to it, and
Right.
they don't have to think about it. But back when we started, Sean, there was you had to know this RSS feed, and then you had to put it
Exactly.
in an app or in a computer program, and then you had to uh, figure all that out. You had to put it on a portable device, usually, like that's iPods or whatever, an MP3 player, and nowadays, it kind of disappears, and even for the podcaster, they don't
Yeah.
have to think about it that much. And I always say my number one rule in anything to do with troubleshooting what's going wrong with your podcast is know what your RSS feed is. I mean,
Know what its address is, what its URL is, where it's actually located. And I know that some people might hear Mike and I kind of laugh a little bit about that, but we do encounter situations where we have to, ask someone that question. We'll go, well, what's your RSS feed? And they'll, respond with an iTunes store link, or they'll respond with a web page link on their website or a media file link. And then we'll have to do a little more research to kind of help them figure that out. But it is important to know. I think most people who are still kind of managing a podcast website probably have what I would call a naked link to their RSS feed on there somewhere, but that's not always a given. We still see plenty of instances where people kind of forget that, and they just go ahead and they link to iTunes and Stitcher and TuneIn and Google Play and all that kind of stuff. And we still think it's important to have that direct link as well. So that might be one place to find it. But if you're not sure, I think the best thing to do is just check in the settings of whatever tools you're using to publish. I mean, if you're using the PowerPress plugin, for example, it's usually right there in the Feeds tab, depending on if you've used any advanced settings. But for the most part, you're going to find your feeds in the Feeds tab. And most other services will probably have something inside the dashboard you can look at to pull that URL. So what's next, Mike?
well, the number one thing that we get, here at support at Blueberry, and I'm sure every other company that does podcasting support, is, hey, I just released my episode and it's not in, name whatever directory, mostly iTunes.
iTunes is the big one.
Yeah, and so everybody goes, I just put out my episode and it's not in iTunes. Oh my gosh, what do I do? Well, the first thing is it could take up to 24 hours under normal circumstances, and sometimes longer. Sometimes Apple's working on their directory, and there's not much you can do about it. They look at your feed when they look at it.
And that can happen. That 24-hour time period can still completely cycle all the way through, even if you log into Podcast Connect, like the minute your episode is live, and click the refresh feed button, which is one of those things that we really don't recommend that you do, because Apple has said if people abuse that, they're going to take it away, and we'd like them not to do that. But regardless, you have very little control over when the iTunes store is going to pick up your latest episode. And one thing to remember that I think a lot of people don't entirely understand is that RSS is a pull technology. It's not a push technology. It's not like sending a text message to someone where they get it on their device and the device, sounds a chime and puts up a notification. RSS sits on your publishing platform, and then it's up to all of these other locations, these destinations, if you will, where your RSS feed goes, to look at the feed and then pull in your latest information and update it on their end. So it's not an automatic thing. And of course, one of the other things to remember when we're talking about iTunes is that when subscribers who've subscribe to your show through either the iTunes desktop application or the iOS podcast app, once they subscribe, actually what happens is their local app or their device makes sort of a one-to-one connection to your RSS feed. And for the most part, the iTunes store backs out. So even though you just posted an episode 1 minute ago, 1 hour ago, 12 hours ago, and it's not showing up yet in that public iTunes store directory that we all love, your current audience will get your latest episode as soon as they refresh the feed. It doesn't matter how long afterwards. So I think a lot of people go into panic mode because they think, well, it's not on iTunes. Nobody can, it's not in the public iTunes store listing, so no one can get the episode. And that's just not true.
Right. And, like you're just using the, Apple app on your phone or the iTunes app on your computer to subscribe directly to that RSS feed,
Right.
Listener. And as a podcaster, that's one of the things you should do is subscribe to your own feed.
Yes.
That way you'll know, if you get it on your phone when you put out an episode, then it's working. Whether the directories all, list that particular episode, it's there and they will update their directory whenever they do.
It is worth noting, I think, because of Apple's relative early entrance into podcasting. They brought podcasting into iTunes. Was it June of 2005, Mike? Do you remember?
Yeah, I think it was June of 2005. It was iTunes version, was it 4.7 or 4.9?
Yeah, 4 dot something.
Yeah.
That, at that time, every podcatcher, which is a term we don't hear so much anymore, was based on this idea that, a podcast listener was getting that one-to-one connection from their aggregator, their podcatcher to your feed. And iTunes, Apple carried that over when they brought podcasting in to iTunes. And in fact, in all of their apps, you can actually do what's called a manual subscription to a feed where you don't even need to go into the store. Now, the reason I bring this up is because there are services, there are popular apps now that work differently. Google Play Music is one of them, where they're actually reserving media to people that subscribe on there. And so that's a little different. So that is a case where if enough time goes by and your newest episode doesn't show up there, then the people who are listening through there are not going to get it. And even though Stitcher does pass through media now, they still handle the aggregation of new podcasts in the same way, where if you subscribe to a show in Stitcher, like you can't take a naked RSS feed and plug it into your Stitcher account, at least as far as I know. You can only subscribe to a show in Stitcher if it's in their app already. So even though we kind of put this emphasis on iTunes and we say, well, don't panic because your current audience is getting your newest episode, in reality, there are some instances where maybe that isn't true, but they are the minority, and it's just something to kind of keep in mind.
Right. And most other apps work, the same way as the Apple apps do. Like I said, with your exception there of Google Play and Stitcher. But, most apps, like Downcast, Overcast, Pocket Cast, whatever other cast, yeah, they just subscribe to the RSS feed. And then once that's done, the app stays out of it, other than you're just using that to get the episode. So,
right. So what's next on our list, Mike?
Let's see. Well, how to check your episode. I kind of have a little checklist that I go through when I post an episode. And first thing I do, and a lot of people say, well, I don't use the Firefox browser, but I'll tell you, the Firefox browser is the easiest way to look at your RSS feed, for the average person. And so just download it, if nothing else, for that. And you just plop your RSS feed, once you know it, in your web browser, like you're going to visit a web page, and you'll notice a couple things about it. You'll see the title of the episode. You'll see, a portion of the blog post, or maybe the whole thing, depending on how you have your settings. And, blogging and podcasting are the same thing, by the way. Just add media for podcasting.
Right.
And, you'll see the enclosure attachment there, the MP3 link. And if you don't see all three of that for that episode, then go check it out, go troubleshoot.
Right.
Some of the ways of troubleshooting is, some of the feed validators. There's plenty of those out there. Some are better than others. Well,
yeah. Let me take just a quick break here, Mike, before we go into validators, because there's a lot to say there. But getting back to your point about what we're looking for in Firefox, because sometimes what happens is, depending on what type of platform you're using, and if you are using kind of a mixed media style platform where you might have blog posts, podcast posts, and apologies if there's noise coming from behind me. I can't do anything about it. It's super noisy here all the time. But anyway, if you're doing a website or whatever platform you're using might have mixed media posts on it, you might accidentally miss adding your podcast episode into, you go to type in your show notes and you forget to put in the podcast information. You hit publish, you walk away, you think you're all done. You realize, wait a minute, it's not showing up somewhere. So you go and you plug your RSS URL into Firefox, as Mike said, and it'll give you that nice human readable thing you can look at. And if you see your most recent entry there, your most recent episode, and it doesn't have the media file there with, a thing you can click on to play it, then there's a pretty good chance you simply forgot to add the podcast information to your post. You go back into your site, you see that, you put it in, you update, and you go on with your life. It's not, it's not a tragic thing that you have to do all these levels of troubleshooting to try and understand. That's a very smart idea, and actually one that I just learned from Mike this week. I never even thought about it, but I know what to look for in an RSS feed. I know how to search for it and figure that out on my own. But for someone who doesn't care to understand at a deeper level how that works,
right. I mean, you could do it in other browsers. You get it, like kind of in Chrome, you'll get just the raw XML. If you, you search for the word enclosure.
Yes.
And make sure that's attached to something that looks like your last post, then that's the same sort of thing. It's just a lot easier in Firefox.
Yeah, I agree. And I like the technique. And that's why I like to say that on the support team at Blueberry, Mike is the Jedi Master. I'm the Padawan Apprentice, because I've learned so much in the last 2.5 years, and I still have so much to learn. So, I'm sorry.
Just because I've been here too long.
Well, that's true. They I feel like they kind of built the company around you, Mike. So, anyway, well, we just started to briefly touch on kind of the next thing to do when Mike mentioned feed validators. And feed validators are important, and you should know about them and you should understand them. But you also need to understand all the caveats there are involved with them.
There's a lot of them.
There are sort of good, better, best feed validators, and they can all still be inconsistent, not only in between each other, but just in themselves. I've had plenty of instances where I went to a validator, plugged in a feed, and it told me this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And 5 minutes later, I plugged in the same feed and everything came up valid. So they're kind of like a guide. They might be able to give you some information on maybe what to check, but it's not, they're not always, I guess, 100%. What would you say, Mike?
Yeah, they're definitely not 100%. And there are some that stay up to date with the latest specs, and there are some that don't stay up to date. And, and even the ones that don't stay up to date are still useful in certain circumstances.
I think for me, and I almost hasten to kind of throw this out, but I guess I will, because I don't know of any other better way to explain it. But oftentimes, if I need to go into validator land to get some help with a feed, I'll start with the pod-based validator, because it's kind of simple and lightweight, and it'll tell you some very important things about your feed, in a very succinct manner. And for anybody that doesn't know the URL, it's kind of, it's a, what do they call that? A URL hack or whatever. It's podba.se, Podbase. And I'm sure if you search it in any search engine, it'll come up first. But
Correct.
you dump your podcast feed in there and ask it to validate, and it runs a series of different checks. And some of them that are very helpful, especially if you're starting out and like you're getting issues submitting your feed to certain directories, because Podbase can tell you if the server that your feed and your media are on handles what are called HTTP head requests. And those are super important. Apple requires those. So if you're hosting your files in some kind of wayward, obscure, corner of the internet that nobody knows about, some server that you got in a closet somewhere, there's a good chance that your server won't be configured to do that. And Podbase can tell you that. And that's a game ender if you try to submit a feed to Apple. If your servers don't accept those requests, then Apple just goes, nope, you got to fix this, come back later.
Yeah.
So that's one example. Podbase also does this nice thing where it'll check your iTunes artwork, and it'll tell you if it's within the big range for their requirements. So, you need to have your artwork not only a certain size in terms of pixels, but you want to try to keep it under a certain file size as well. So Podbase will tell you, hey, your artwork size is only 1,000 pixels square. It needs to be minimum of 1,400. Oh, and by the way, it's a 15 megabyte file. Now, I don't know how you do that, but I don't know how you would actually achieve that combination of those two things. But you do not want to use a 15 megabyte artwork file. That will cause you problems. So Podbase will warn you of that, and a few other things. Mike, you have any other insights on Podbase?
Yeah, Charles Wilchin, the guy behind that, and he does a really good job with it. Another thing it'll tell you is if you're using, and sorry about the sirens going through behind me, noisy today.
Yep. Busy Saturday in America.
Yeah, must be. But anyway, Podbase, awesome. There's a couple others out there that we do recommend. Cast Feed Validator is another one. Castfeedvalidator.com, and it approaches it a little differently than Podbase does. What's nice about that, and right now currently they're having some sort of issue over there, but they'll get it fixed. But Cast Feed Validator will actually give you kind of a preview of what your feed's going to look like in the different aggregators. Not necessarily Apple, but it kind of give you your different episodes, show you the artwork, tell you if the artwork's too big. One thing that one's particularly good at is figuring out how big your feed is in kilobytes.
Yeah, which is useful.
There's kind of a limit to that.
Yeah.
And you want to make sure you try to keep your RSS feed below, what is it, 0.5 megabyte is the current?
Yeah, it's kind of the recommendation. It starts to get sluggish between, it seems, 500K and 1 megabyte is when you might start to run into problems. So
right, and that's as we said, all these aggregators, iTunes, all of them are a pull technology, and they've got just a certain amount of time when they're coming around checking your feed that if it takes too long for your feed to pull into the directory, they're just going to skip you for that round, and that might delay your show getting into those directories. So Cast Feed Validator is pretty good at that. It gives you a pretty good indication of the actual file size, where Podbase actually gives you a time. How long did it take?
Yeah, which is very useful. I would say when we go back to our don't panic list, if you don't get the green checkbox from Podbase under the load time, don't panic about that, because it looks
over 5 seconds, maybe.
I think it's lower than that. I think it's anything over 2 seconds.
Right, but what I mean is if it says it was 5 seconds, well, you're probably okay at 5 seconds.
Yeah. So the last one on the list, and we really caution people to use this one, but sometimes it is still handy, is the old trusty feed validator at feedvalidator.org. And this one has been around the longest, and it has gone the longest since having any useful updates. So we really caution people on it. And the thing about feed validator where people get confused is it'll tell you, it'll say this feed is valid, but for maximum fun, maximum interoperability. And then it'll give you depending on what's in your feed, it'll give you a big long list of things. And people go, oh no, my feed is destroyed. What do I do? But they skip over that part at the top that says, no, this feed is actually okay, but these are suggestions. And the majority of those are ignorable. I would say,
and one thing real quick is if you get a thing that says it's not valid, look at the reason for that. If you're using SSL, if you've got an HTTPS feed, feedvalidator.org, and same thing with W3 Validator, which is another blog feed validator. Both of those don't know anything about SSL. So they're going to fail you right there just if you have an SSL feed. So just know that.
One thing that can be very useful, I've found, that Feed Validator does, I mean, it's really the only one of these validators that does it, is it will find parsing errors. And sometimes those are very important because they can break your feed. And typically, a parsing error in a feed is caused by some kind of unusual code that got entered somewhere. And one example, this comes up pretty frequently. I'm on a lot of I hang out on all the different podcast forums I can get involved in. It's kind of a sickness at this point. And one thing that happens probably, I would say, once a week on the SoundCloud support forum. So that's somewhere where people who use SoundCloud are posting, and they're mostly just relying on SoundCloud tools. But apparently in SoundCloud's post editor, whatever you want to call it, it's publishing tool, you can actually include emoji. And I don't know if just flat out emoji break RSS feeds universally, or if there's something in SoundCloud's code translator or whatever that does it. But I think at least once or twice a week, I see posts on there from people who go, hey, my feed stopped updating. My feed's not valid. I don't know why. And I'll ask them for their feed. And sometimes they know how to find that, and sometimes they don't, which goes back to what we talked about earlier. And they'll put their feed URL in, and I'll immediately go to Feed Validator, plug it in, and I'll know if it comes up with a parsing error that they probably had a post that they created that had emoji in it. And once they go and strike the emoji, the parsing error disappears and the feed is valid. Now, Podbase isn't really detailed enough for that kind of thing. And Cast Feed Validator kind of is. So that's just an example. But I feel like the Podbase, Cast Feed Validator are the ones to start with, and maybe Feed Validator, if you can't get anywhere else. And I think Mike has a comment.
Yeah, I was just going to say another common problem with parsing errors is depending on where you edit your show notes. If you edit your show notes in Microsoft Word or Google Docs or any other sort of editor that is not just a plain text editor, you can have issues. Now, of course, we deal a lot with WordPress posts since PowerPress is WordPress based. A lot of people won't write right in WordPress. They'll write in Word or Apple's, whatever their thing is. And right. So what you do is you can go ahead and edit in all those things, and your formatting isn't going to hold. And that's the problem. There's little code that gets put into the text that you can't see when you paste it into WordPress in particular, but I'm sure it works the same pretty much any other tool. But you have to clean that out. So the way I do that on my Mac or in PC, it would also work, but you open up a text editor and make sure that you convert that to plain text, then paste it into your post, then do your formatting in, say, WordPress or whatever tool you're in. because that will cause parsing errors. All those little codes that Microsoft Word puts in there, or Apple Pages or whatever it's called.
Markdown.
Yeah, it's a markdown code that you don't see, but it's in there, and that will cause issues as well, especially just parsing feeds, because a lot of times you'll just get the random error from Apple saying can't parse your feed. Well,
Yeah, they don't give you details.
Give you any details, so that's how you find it.
All right, what's next after validators, Mike?
Validators. Well, of course, if you find anything wrong in the validator, and one of the ways to find out what's wrong is to use Google. Google is your friend, or search engines in general, but Google especially. So Google those warnings. You'll find somebody's had that problem at some point, and that's probably the number one place to start looking for help. Is just do a good old fashioned Google search.
One tip I'll throw out, just on the off chance that someone does find themselves over at Feed Validator and they're looking at all those warnings. Some things you can almost always write off completely are namespace warnings. Feed Validator doesn't like the Google Play namespace, and it doesn't like the raw voice namespace for our plugin PowerPress.
And it doesn't like a lot of new Apple tags either. So.
That's true, and it does, and all the new tags, as Mike mentioned, that came with iOS 11. It doesn't know what any of those are, and it refers to them as something like invalid element or something like that.
Right.
And you can see right in there, it'll say whatever the warning is, invalid element, iTunes : episode or whatever. So you immediately know, oh, that's one of the new tags. Feed Validator doesn't know about it because it's old and hasn't been updated. So I, in turn, as a podcaster, don't need to worry about it as well. Same thing with those namespace warnings. They're completely irrelevant.
Exactly. But, if you do get a warning, that comes up in, say, one of the older validators or even the newer ones, go ahead and Google it.
Yeah. Never hurts. You'll probably find, something, and it's kind of, I mean, in its own way, troubleshooting really is just detective work. You're peeling back the layers until you sort of find what the problem is, and then, you can implement a solution. And in the day-to-day work that Mike and I do with Blueberry, that's really all we do. We're just a bit more experienced at it, so we kind of know these ways to go at it. But there's no rule that says you can't take whatever it is, 20 minutes to search it yourself and see what you can find. Maybe you can't find anything, but you might easily find a solution and just go in, fix it, and everything's done. And you've, used 5 minutes of your time, hopefully without too much panic.
Right. And, if that doesn't come up with anything, then definitely, contact support for whatever system you're on. If it's PowerPress, that'd be us. If it's Blueberry, that'd be us. If it's Libsyn, go to Libsyn support. Most platforms have a robust support team. Some better than others, of course. But what it is.
We're biased, but most of them are pretty good.
Right. And the key is also give them enough time. We're busy. I'm talking, industry wide. We're support's pretty busy. I don't know if you've noticed this, but when we first started, everybody that was doing podcasting was a geek. And tech savvy. Well, not so much anymore. So, and that's great. It's good that people are getting into it, but there's a lot of people that are not as tech savvy and also not as patient. So be patient.
Yeah.
A little time to respond. We're usually fairly quick about it.
I think so. And I think most of the good companies are. And that's kind of just I think that's a good rule of thumb across the board. It doesn't matter if you need help with a podcast, or, if you need help with your phone or your computer, or you just bought a blender from the store, or whatever the situation is where you need some help. If you've exhausted all of those other avenues first, then, reach out to whatever the official contact point is for that product. And, when we get back to podcasting, especially if you're paying, if you're paying us at Blueberry, then we're obligated to help you. And I believe that every other podcasting space, or every other company in the podcasting space that, that takes paying customers. So that includes Libsyn, Podbean, Spreaker, etc. down the line. You know, there are people there who would say, you pay us for this service, we want to help you fix it. Like this should not be, you know, it shouldn't be a contrarian relationship where,
Exactly.
and if you feel that way about the company you're with, then it's probably time to go somewhere else, because you don't want to be in that situation where you're like, well, I give you money, but you never help me when I need help. If you feel that way about whatever company you're with, then, you know, it's time to maybe reevaluate. But it's still a good idea when you do contact support through whatever means they provide, and different companies have, you know, different ways to do that. At Blueberry, we actually have a public forum, and we get support requests there, and then we have an email contact form, and we even have a phone number. And you know, that'll, you know, if Mike's not already on a call, he will pick up during, you know, East Coast business hours. Oh, right there.
It's all dirty, aren't it?
Yeah, it doesn't look so good on cam, but that's all right. It just shows you that you're working hard, Mike. You're using the technology. You're helping people.
Yeah, I'm trying.
Yes, exactly. So it's just something to keep in mind. Just, you know, be a little patient. You will get a response, and I think under most circumstances, it'll be in a timely manner. I know I've had a few occasions where, even not as a customer, I've reached out to, you know, just as a user of their free services, a few of these other platforms, and I say I've gotten a response probably within less than a day every time. I mean, we understand that people kind of get panicky when they think that things are broken, but you know, we really do our best to get back to people in a reasonable amount of time.
Yeah, and we've got a lot of time zones covered here. You know, we've got,
that is true.
You out in California, me and Charles here in the Eastern time zone, even Todd once in a while out in Hawaii. So,
yeah,
you know, via email, pretty much 24/7, somebody will get back to you in a reasonable amount of time. Now, you know, we all got to sleep.
Right. At some point. So after you've, let's say, Mike, that you've got one of two scenarios happening. You've reached out to your official support person or people for your company, and maybe more time has elapsed than you can afford for whatever reason. Or there's also another scenario that can happen in podcasting, because we do have this kind of rich and varied tool set available to us, where sometimes people will really, you know, roll their own everything, where they're like, I'm not gonna go to Blueberry. I'm not gonna go to Podbean. I'm going to roll my own server. I'm going to create my own. I'm going to go out and get all these open source tools. Or on the other hand, maybe they're not very tech savvy and they're on a really low budget, which I totally respect. And they're using things like Blogger or WordPress.com, FeedBurner, and things like Internet Archive, where those are all viable tools to publish a podcast, but they don't necessarily have any immediate support, like where you can contact a person built in. So when a problem happens, you know, that's really on your back to kind of fix that. And that's where that kind of value proposition of, you know, paying a hosting company anywhere from $5 to $15 a month at the low end, depending on the company, can potentially save you a lot of hassle down the road. But regardless of that, in those instances, Mike, what do you think is the next best thing to try?
Well, a lot of people definitely skip all the above.
Unfortunately,
and they go on social media and ask for help, and that's great. You know, if you're rolling your own and you are your own support, and you know there's other people out there that have probably done that. I mean, Sean and I both probably have hand coded an RSS feed at one point.
And I will say that's out of my experience, but in the early days, my very first podcast site was run through a movable type installation that I rolled myself, and I still don't know how I did that, but I figured it out. And thankfully, this was back in January of 2005. And, you know, this is how things have changed, because I wouldn't ever recommend this now, except in very, very, very specific circumstances. But right about the time that I was getting ready FeedBurner, happened, and they added podcast support. So they kind of, between rolling my own movable type site where I was able to get a source RSS feed, and then FeedBurner coming up with podcast support. And back then it was a startup. They hadn't been bought by Google yet.
Right.
That solved the other problem, because I looked at RSS feed. I can look at an RSS feed now, and I couldn't sit down and code one, but I know how to read it. But back then I looked at it and I went, oh, I don't know what any of this is. I have no idea how to make an RSS feed for podcasting. So FeedBurner fixed that for me back then. So I got lucky in those regards. But, you know, if, as Mike is saying, if you're in that mindset, if you are someone who is really, you're just full on DIY all the way out, then you're going to run into that situation where if you need help with something, you're going to have to, you know, rely on things like search engines and that kind of thing.
And the community and social media or Reddit,
yeah, exactly.
or, you know, there's lots of places to
exactly.
You know, but I mean, don't jump there first. That's the thing. You know, especially if you're with Blueberry or any of the other systems, you know, because we would rather you contact us directly than for us to you know, hear that you have a problem in public before we've had a chance to do it otherwise.
I guess, I mean, and this is funny. I actually had this happen to me yesterday. So at Blueberry, we use Slack, the messaging app. It's really great because we have a distributed team. As Mike said earlier, our main office is in Ohio. Mike's in Michigan. I'm in California. Todd's in Hawaii. Charles is in the Atlanta area. And we have other team members kind of scattered throughout the country. So it's a nice place where we can all communicate together. And, you know, it's maybe not as good as us all being in the same room, but it's as good as we're going to be able to do. And I had an issue with the Slack. This is fun to say. The Slack Mac app, the Mac app on Slack. That's kind of more fun to say. Yesterday, because for some reason, something in the UI in my app wasn't working the same way as it had just, I don't know, the last time I had used it earlier in the day. And I was like, what's going on? And I'm going, oh man, I got to go out on Twitter now and go yell at Slack and be like, why did you break my app? And I was like, okay, wait a minute. Let's take a step back. I closed the app and reopened it, and the problem was still there. So, okay. So I closed out all the apps on my Mac and got my Mac back to kind of a base state of neutrality, restarted, brought back all my apps that were open, and the problem in Slack was gone. So Troubleshooting 101 is what? Turn it off, turn it back on again. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to something like that.
Plugged in?
Or is it plugged in? Exactly. That's Troubleshooting 101. And anyway, I got a funny story about that, but it's not relevant to this. So, you know, I've sidetracked myself, Mike. Get me back into podcast day.
Well, it's just like I said. There's times to go to social media and complain about your service provider, and there's times to contact them directly.
Try to get direct help first. And if you look at that as a strategy, sometimes it works. I mean, I've done that thing where
it definitely gets people's attention. You know,
I mean, but you think about everything you do. I mean, I heard this great analogy somewhere once, and I wish I could remember what the source was. And this guy said, the exchange of money, and it doesn't matter if it's, you're paying Blueberry $12 a month for media hosting or $5 a month for pro stats, or if you're earlier today, I went down to the Mexican restaurant in the corner and I paid cash for a breakfast burrito. Whatever the mechanics of that exchange of giving someone money, that's one of the most intimate things that you can actually do. And when you do that, you sort of create a relationship. And not to get too into too much woo-woo territory over here, but think about any other relationship you have in life. You wouldn't go, if you know, I don't know, your significant other left the car keys on the counter and you couldn't find them the next day, or something like that. You wouldn't run over to them and yell at them and go, "Hey, I can't find the keys." You know, you'd look around for them first and all that kind of stuff. So looking at it from that perspective, you know, when you just have a problem and then you kind of freak out a little bit, run to Twitter, run to Facebook, especially if you go to something like a Facebook podcasting group where there's a million of those. And I try very hard, as I said earlier, it's a sickness, but I try very hard to look at all of them every day that I'm aware of. But there's no way that any human being can monitor all of them all day. It's just not possible. So when you employ that method, then you kind of subvert the natural flow of getting help. And we have to kind of go, because sometimes in our case, if someone is a Blueberry customer, we may need account information from you, and we don't want you to post that in a public forum. So we might go, you know, email us at whatever address, or sometimes I'll tell people to email me directly, just so that, you know, and I think some people see that and they think it's like a subversion. Like they're like, oh, they're just trying to put the fire out, you know, they don't really want to help them on Facebook or whatever. They want to just get them, you know, out of that space into this other space. But sometimes we really need to get, you know, information from you. And Mike's waving at me, so I'll let him speak.
Hey, well, it's better than talking over you. No, I was just gonna say, you know, we need information. You know, nothing worse than I get these emails sometimes, or I'll get a phone call, mostly emails that say my podcast is broke, fix it, and that's all the information I get. And you don't use the email they use to log into Blueberry, so I can't find them that way. I don't have the name of their show. I don't have any way of you know, figuring out what they want. So, you know, when you do contact support, or you know, and this goes for anywhere, give them as much information as possible about the problem and who you are, what your account is, you know, whatever you know the problem is. But give us all the relevant information. Don't let us, you know, don't have us have to search or ask you for it. That gets it a lot quicker. You know, getting quicker support is the whole goal.
Yeah, we talked earlier about how in so many instances, troubleshooting a problem kind of is detective work. But you can create more detective work by making us have to ask you, you know, what is your name? What is your email address? What's your feed URL? What's your iTunes list? Like, that's a good one. If your iTunes store listing isn't updating and you're concerned about that, give us the URL to the iTunes store, because this goes back all the way to the beginning. We're almost making this full circle, because sometimes we find out people will come to us at Blueberry and go, my iTunes store listing isn't updating. And we'll ask them what the URL is. And here's another handy tip. Getting back to Podbase, which we mentioned earlier, the validator, you can take any URL from the iTunes store. Doesn't matter if it's, you know, a show produced by Mike or me or Gimlet Media or NPR. You can take any iTunes store URL and plug it into Podbase, and it'll tell you what the source feed URL is that iTunes store listing is working off of. And, you know, not often, but every now and then somebody will contact us at Blueberry and go, my iTunes store is broke. And we'll look it up and we'll find out, well, they're using someone else's service to generate the feed. And we'll have to go. And, you know, sometimes I'll run it through a validator real quickly anyway, and just see if there's something really obvious. And if there is, I'll reply with that. And then I'll go, and by the way, this is, you know, Libsyn's feed that you're using, so you need to contact their support for further assistance or something like that.
Now, I'll get phone calls sometimes with somebody, and, you know, by the time I figure it out, they're a customer of somebody else. And I'll say, well, you know, call them. And, well, they don't have a phone number. Sorry.
Yeah.
But we generally try to help anybody that gets a hold of us.
Oh, yeah.
As long as it's something within our control, or at least our knowledge base.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Obviously, there are so many different platforms now and so many different ways to publish a podcast. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But there's no way any one person, and certainly not any one company, can be intimately familiar with, you know, all the different methods. It's just not possible. So let's see where we're at here. We got about 5 minutes left. So,
Yeah.
anything else we can kind of tag on here, Mike? Any thoughts that you have?
No,
Or
well, like I
did
said,
we
we
have
had a
anything else
couple
in the
other little
outline?
subjects we thought, yeah, we could tell funny stories, but one of the things we get, being a hosting company is, somebody comes up or someone emails us say, "Hey, I'm out of space, but I thought that you said that we could fit an hour-long podcast into our space once a week," and then we go look at it, and they're doing 320 kilobits M3s, or worse yet, uploading a wave. By the way,
Wait.
waves do not work. Don't use waves.
The one tag I'll put on the thing with waves is I think that there may be at least a couple hosting companies out there that will transcode on the backside, or they'll not transcode, but they'll encode on the backside. So you give them an uncompressed file like a wave, and they'll turn it into an MP3. And that's one of those things that if a person starts doing this and they don't necessarily understand that kind of basic concept of how that's supposed to work, they may just figure that's how you do it. So
Right. Yeah, and that, you can't blame them for it. I'm just saying, a lot of times we'll get somebody that uploads a 10-minute wave file that eats up their entire bandwidth or their entire storage for the month, and you got to explain to them, well, yeah, you just loaded this huge file, or even high bit rate MP3s. 64K mono is perfectly good audio. I mean, a lot of these NPR podcasts are encoded at something around that, and
right.
And if you want stereo, and I always tell people that the only reason you would ever want stereo in a podcast would be if you're doing jazz or classical music. And I'll tell you a quick funny story about that. I have a buddy that's a broadcast engineer for a NPR station here, and the rest of the time they play classical music, and he was up there messing with the transmitter, and he unplugged something in the middle of the night, and he replugged it back in, but he got the left and right channel backwards. Well, people that are fans of classical music can tell that. That, hey, the drum section was on the wrong side of my speakers here. So he had to go up in the middle of the night and crisscross those wires to get the left and right channel in the right spot. But anyway, that's a seriously off top subject. But
personally, I'm a fan still, and this is probably irrational, but I'm sticking with it. That just suits my personal brand. 96. I'm a fan of 96 kilobit joint stereo. I like it a little bit better than 64 kilobit mono, but unless you have a very music heavy program, I don't see any reason at this point, given where we are in terms of technology, given where we are just with the fact that MP3 is still kind of the de facto standard. I don't see any reason to go higher than that unless you're doing a very music heavy show. And I mean, like 90% of your show is playing songs, and then 128 kilobit joint stereo is good for that. And anything over that is overkill for a podcast.
Yeah, for the most part, most podcasters, it's real, spoken word, and spoken word in mono is good. And, and a lot of people listen at work. This is one thing, with the total stereo thing. Is a lot of people listen at work, and they can only put one earbud in because they're trying to hide it from their boss.
They're like this, but with earbuds.
Yeah, there you go.
Doesn't really work for me with these headphones on cam, but yeah, they're doing that. So that's one of those things that to keep in mind if you're trying to get clever with the panning, left and right, and you want to kind of put voices hard one way or the other. If somebody's sitting there with one ear in, they're going to only hear half the conversation. They're probably not even going to listen.
Right. And, and I always like to tell people, that worry about that when, they uploaded their 320 kilobit thing. I say, most people are listening on the crappy little earbuds that come with their phone, or they're listening on, an equally lousy Bluetooth speaker, or, hooked to their car stereo via Bluetooth. And some of that's getting a lot better, but back in the day, that was lousy. So, all this emphasis on perfect, absolute, crystal clear audio, may be a little, of the wrong thing at the wrong time.
Indeed.
And I see we're getting the hook here pretty soon. Hi, Dave.
Hey guys, hey Mike and Sean, man, we appreciate it. Podcast problems. I know this is a session that people were looking forward to. It's always something that interests people. There's so many things that go wrong, and like you said, you can scream and yell on social media. Why not just give the good folks at Blueberry a call? Let them help you out. So before we end this hour, Mike and Sean, let us know where we can go for any of the Blueberry information. Also, if you guys have your own personal podcast, your own websites, where can people go to find the work that you guys are doing?
You first, Mike.
Okay, of course, I work at Blueberry, same with Sean. If you ever need to get a hold of us, it's blueberry.com, and use the contact form there for support. My personal podcast is Podcast Help Desk at podcasthelpdesk.com, and I also do a show on Steve and Dave's network, which I'm going to have some episodes soon, called Geek of the North over on modernlife.network. And if you guys want a free month of anything at Blueberry, Blueberry 2000, or what is it? Blueberry 005 is the promo code. So go ahead, Sean.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, my name is Sean Thorpe, and I am with the Blueberry support team. And as Mike said, you can, if you have a Blueberry support issue, you can go over to blueberry.com, use the contact form. And what's great about doing that is everybody on the support team will see it, so it gets to everybody, as opposed to, say, just emailing me directly or Mike directly or whatever, even though, of course, we will gladly get back to you in a reasonable amount of time. But outside of that, you can find everything I do online, podcast or otherwise. I'm kind of involved in a lot of different things, but you can go to my personal website. That's Sean, SHAWN.MX, and everything is listed there.
Excellent. Well, hey, guys, thank you. Blueberry, always appreciate the platinum sponsor. Make sure you guys stick around for the broadcast at 6 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Todd Cochran from Raw Voice and Blueberry is going to be sharing proven social media strategies for podcasters, a very similar session to what he shared at Podcast Movement in Anaheim. So on behalf of myself, the Blueberry team, happy International Podcast Day, everybody. Continue to use that hashtag, and we will see you in a few minutes. Thanks, guys.
Bye.